Hey, Becca.
Hi, Kim.
All right, so we're here to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I think this is such an interesting book because when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." He said Uncle Tom's Cabin actually started the Civil War. So, how does a book start a war?
I think that's a really good question, Kim, and these next two videos are going to help us understand a little bit more why Lincoln said that. How does a little book start a war? So, this book was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here she is, Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was born in Litchfield, Connecticut, to this kind of great abolitionist family. So, what's abolitionism, Kim?
Well, abolitionism was the belief mostly in the early 19th century, that slavery should be ended immediately. So there were varieties of beliefs about the institution of slavery in early America. Some people obviously were very pro-slavery, believed that it was a natural institution sanctioned by the Bible. Some people, like Abraham Lincoln, at least early in his political career, just wanted slavery to stay where it was. And those were what we would call free soilers or anti-slavery advocates. They said, all right, we can't get rid of slavery in the South. It's too entrenched there as an institution, but we can make sure that it does not spread to any of the Western territories that we might settle in the future. But abolitionists were the strongest opponents of slavery. They said that slavery should be ended today, everywhere in the United States and the world, and that it is an immoral, unchristian institution. So these Western territories were a really big part of the increasing tension over the institution of slavery in the 1850s. So in 1848, the United States won the Mexican-American War, and they got a whole bunch of new territory that had once been Mexico. And these will become the states of Texas and Oklahoma and many of the sort of Midwestern states we have today. But this now threatened the balance of power between those slaveholding states in U.S. Congress and those that were free states. So now everyone is wondering, is slavery going to spread to the West? Should slavery spread to the West?
And this kind of anxiety about the Western expansion of slavery was more tense and became more sectionally divided after the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 happened right here in 1850. And the Compromise of 1850, I like to think of it kind of like a Band-Aid over this sectional tension. So I'll draw you guys a little Band-Aid.
This is like a gaping wound, right? And the Compromise of 1850 is just like this tiny little Band-Aid that's kind of holding this dam together, to mix my metaphors.
The Compromise of 1850 actually admitted California as a free state, which was a really big win for the North, obviously.
Right, lots of gold.
But it also had a really strong Fugitive Slave Act. So this was a really kind of critical part of the Compromise of 1850, and this was a big win for the South. So why was it a big win?
Well, the Fugitive Slave Act said that if a marshal was in your town requesting your help in rounding up an escaped slave, you had to help that marshal or face charges yourself. So this meant that any time that someone who was enslaved in the South made a run for the North, a run for Canada, as many of the enslaved people did, anyone in the North might be drafted to help return that person to the South.
And if they didn't, they were oftentimes fined, and this really made all Northerners participatory in slavery. Even if they weren't slaveholders themselves or living on a plantation in the South, Northerners were participating in the way that slavery was held together by disallowing runaway slaves from continuing their lives in free territories.
So you can imagine how this might really galvanize a Northern audience into action about slavery, because before you might think, well, I don't like slavery, but what does it have to do with me, right? I'm just a grain miller living in Pennsylvania. None of my business. I don't like it, but I can't do anything about it, and it's not my fault. Now, all of a sudden, if an escaped slave comes past your house and a marshal follows him or her, now you've got to be a person to round that person up. And so that means you have to participate in slavery directly. And so you might find yourself thinking, you know what, I refuse to do that. And that means that I really do hate slavery.
And this was definitely the sentiment that Stowe and her family had on the Underground Railroad. So Stowe lived on a stop in the Underground Railroad, and that was this passageway for Southern slaves to get to the North. And Stowe and her husband actually helped a lot of runaway slaves.
So the Underground Railroad wasn't like a literal railroad, right? I mean, that would be pretty sweet if there were a railroad that went under the ground all the way up to Canada. But it was more like a sort of informal network of people who might help escaped slaves, direct them to food and shelter, and just kind of send them along to the next waypost on their trip, either to the North or to Canada.
And so when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed with the Compromise of 1850, the Band-Aid, this really upset Harriet Beecher Stowe and really was one of the main catalysts for her writing this book. She also witnessed a slave auction, and this Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about as just this terrible kind of scene of a family being just torn apart. And this was a really common practice within slavery, that the unit of the family was not respected as slaveholders wanted to sell their slaves to different plantations throughout the South. And this slave auction really became the basis for the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Slave auctions were absolutely terrible. In fact, not long before the Civil War, the main slave auction site in Washington, D.C. was just around the corner from the White House. So imagine walking down the thoroughfare of this great democracy, seeing the president's house, the seat of government, and then turning a corner and seeing people being sold off the block. You know, Abraham Lincoln saw a slave auction in New Orleans, and he said it was one of the things that most influenced him to hate slavery, just witnessing these families being torn apart. And imagine either watching a mother being sold away from her infant children, or being that mother, wondering what it would be like if you're ever going to see them again.
I think that's a really important point, just to show that this was something that was happening all around the United States, and this was just abolitionist fervor was bubbling up. And then in 1852, when this book was published, it really set into motion this new wave of political rhetoric and other novels, and just a lot of talk about these fundamental contradictions between Christianity and human bondage.
And we'll get to that in the next video.
Hey, Kim.
Hey, Becca. So we've been talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and said to have been one of the main causes of the American Civil War. So remind me again what Uncle Tom's Cabin was actually about.
So Uncle Tom's Cabin was about the horrors of slavery in the Deep South, and also appealed to a lot of Americans' Christian values and tried to point out these fundamental contradictions between Christian faith and slavery.
So it was published in 1852. How did people receive this book?
So there was a lot of mixed reactions, but it was the most read book of the 19th century.
Wow.
So there were a lot of reactions. And so in the North, mostly people were reading this all the time. No matter if you were an intellectual or just kind of a 17-year-old picking up a book off a shelf, you were going to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And a lot of the people that actually read the book were young men that would later fight in the Civil War.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so like this would be our book club book of the month, except this was like the Oprah's book club choice of 1852. Right?
Exactly.
Everybody was reading it.
Yeah, there's really almost nothing like it, like not even Harry Potter, but it did have the same international scope that Harry Potter does today.
So it was popular in the northern United States and elsewhere in the world. So where else was it popular?
Mostly in Europe, but it was translated into over 60 languages.
Wow.
And this also kind of put the spotlight on American slavery. So there was all this international attention. What is going on in America, and what's going to happen?
It's so interesting. It reminds me of The King and I. If you've seen that, the woman goes to Siam and shows people the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they put on a version of a play based on Uncle Tom's Cabin in what would be Thailand.
So this makes it this kind of international spectacle. The fate of slavery had to be somehow figured out, and everyone was watching.
That's so interesting. So I'm imagining that white Southerners were not big fans of this book.
So white Southerners were definitely not a fan of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in response, there was this movement of these things called anti-Tom novels. So here's an anti-Tom novel right next to us. Right over here, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. So Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, yes, very creative name. These anti-Tom novels aim to point out that maybe Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't know what she was actually talking about. They also accused Harriet Beecher Stowe of not actually even living in the Deep South, so she didn't even know what slavery was like. They wanted to paint Southern slave society in this really positive light. They wanted to show all the ways that it actually maintained social order and promoted economic welfare. So this was kind of this response from the South, also in novel form.
Yeah, so it's this big kind of cultural battle over the interpretation of slavery. You have people on one hand saying, slavery is destructive to families, slavery is incompatible with Christianity, and then responses from the white South saying, oh no, actually slavery is great, it helps everybody.
Right, so there was this kind of battle within the literary community about the peculiar institution of slavery. Which one was it?
So what if I'm illiterate, right? I mean, not everybody in 19th century America was a New England intellectual who was reading Christian novels. How would I have heard about Uncle Tom's Cabin?
That's a really good point, Kim. So Tom shows were depictions of Uncle Tom's Cabin in theaters around the world. And so they were oftentimes put on by abolitionist people trying to point out the issues with slavery today and end slavery immediately.
So this is before there's copyright law, right? So you can just put on a show of anybody's novel if you feel like it.
Exactly. But oftentimes they really misconstrued the novel and actually now are remembered as contributing to the problem of racism in America.
Racial stereotypes too, I would imagine, because we still have this phrase Uncle Tom kind of to mean an African American who is a martyr to the status quo as opposed to someone who might fight against racism. It seems like they might have borrowed a lot of these stereotypes from minstrel shows, which were also very popular in this time period.
And some of the characters within these minstrel shows turned into the character that was remembered as Jim Crow, which became the dominating racial order after the Civil War. So in the civil rights era in the mid-1950s, lots of activists actually wanted to completely reject the progress that Uncle Tom's Cabin and these Tom shows had made because they actually reduced African Americans to this terrible stereotype. And so later on, this kind of idea that someone was an Uncle Tom became a racial slur, really. And they then rejected Uncle Tom's Cabin as being a tool towards racial equality and more saw it as a part of the problem.
So I think the most important thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that it's this catalyst of really intense emotions about slavery, which in the 1850s will lead eventually to the Civil War. And, following the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you'll see more and more violence on both sides of this issue. For example, John Brown, this famous abolitionist, actually goes out to Kansas and murders people.
And I think that Lincoln was very astute in pointing out that Uncle Tom's Cabin really catalyzed a lot of this violence. And he even met with Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she earned herself a little meeting with Abraham Lincoln.
And he said, "So you're the little lady that started this great war." I'm trying to think of another book that has started a war.
I think we would probably remember that. But I do think Lincoln was really astute in pointing out just how impactful this cultural phenomenon, this Tom mania, was on the question of slavery and on the fate of the American people. And really, it just begged the question in a new way in this kind of public setting. I mean, I just think that the book itself, the way that the book could just travel all around the United States and so many different kinds of people were able to read it and get their hands on it, this really was just this movement of people just thinking a lot about slavery, reading a lot about slavery.
Yeah, well, I think, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, I don't think there was a way to not have an opinion on the slavery issue. Either you were for it or you were against it, and that divisiveness would lead to the Civil War.
And again, there's this international focus, there's a deeper sectional divide between the North and the South, and there was this kind of sorting over the slavery question that Uncle Tom's Cabin really promoted.
So, Becca and I have been talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is this book from the 1850s that Abraham Lincoln actually said started the Civil War. So, how did this book start a war?
So in this video, we'll tell you a little bit more about the plot, but in the previous video, we kind of discussed what was going on in the country at the time, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, again, was from this abolitionist family. She was really deeply affected by the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, and also by slave auctions. So this video will get a little bit more into the heart of the plot of the novel, which does have to do with the family being torn apart.
All right, so what was Uncle Tom's Cabin actually about?
Uncle Tom's Cabin was set on a plantation in Kentucky, and it starts out with this kind of group of slaves that are about to be sold to other plantation owners. And so Eliza and her son actually run away. They run up north, so Eliza goes up north. And Uncle Tom is sold down the river.
So, Eliza is trying to make sure that she and her son are not separated by being sold. So she decides that she's going to escape and take her son with her up to Canada. But Uncle Tom, he's not actually related to, he is sold in the opposite direction. He's getting farther away from freedom by heading down the Mississippi. When you think about the sort of geography of slavery, it's a much more urban environment in some of the more coastal areas. So you might be in Charleston, or you might even be in Baltimore as an enslaved person, and you might have a pretty high degree of freedom and also a possibility of escape, either by crossing the border or by boat. When you're sold into this sort of deep South area, you are deep in plantation country, and there might not be another soul that you could rely on to help you escape for 100, 200 miles.
And I think this is really something that Harriet Beecher Stowe wants to help point out in the book, that there was this sense of doom for Uncle Tom. However, his Christian faith was the only thing that really kept him going. And he bonded with this young white woman he met, Eva, just about their Christian faith. And really reading his Bible was the thing that got him up in the morning. So where were those kind of feelings about religion coming from?
You can definitely see that Harriet Beecher Stowe is influenced by her own family's faith, which is influenced by the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening was this kind of flowering of religious belief in the 1830s and 1840s. It was kind of a reaction against the era of Enlightenment, which was what had inspired the founders of the United States to think of a more humanist world, a more rational, scientific world. People start going to camp meetings, they have religious revivals, they experience religious conversions. And in this time period, there's kind of a shift in thinking about God in the United States. If you think back to the Puritans, they have this incredibly punitive, sort of Old Testament destroyer God, right? One of the most famous early sermons in the United States is "Sinners in the hands of an angry God, that at any moment God might release you into the flames." Well, there's a new emphasis on Christ-like love in the early 1830s, 1840s. New interpretation of God as being forgiving and gentle, family-oriented. It's very Victorian. Where God was seen as this punisher who condemned most people to hell, in the Second Great Awakening, there's a new emphasis on a forgiving, kind, family-oriented Jesus who will save everyone. And that's very incompatible with the ideas of slavery.
Exactly. And I think that Uncle Tom's Cabin can really be considered a part of the Second Great Awakening because of the way that it points out these fundamental inconsistencies and contradictions between Christian faith and human bondage. How could a religion that says, treat thy neighbor as thyself, actually sanction slavery?
So Uncle Tom is kind of this martyr character, right? He is a devout believer in Christianity and the forgiveness of God right up until his very end. So how does Uncle Tom's Cabin actually end?
So Uncle Tom's Cabin ends with Uncle Tom is beaten by his overseers. He's sold kind of through this chain of different slave families in the Deep South, and he ends up with just a terrible, terrible slaveholder who requests his death, actually partially because he was reading all of this religious text.
And this slave owner was named Simon Legree. And kind of this name, Simon Legree, has actually stuck with us in popular culture to mean a really evil, cruel, punitive master.
And the rest of the family actually meets back up. Eliza is reunited with a bunch of other people that were on the original plantation, and they really think about Uncle Tom as this martyr. They hear of his death, and he's looked at as kind of this sacrifice for the cause of freedom.
Right, and then also Uncle Tom, he dies never having renounced his Christian faith, and his example of martyrdom actually leads everyone who witnesses his death, including Simon Legree, to convert to Christianity and to vow never to hold slaves again.
And I think the ending of the book really points out this main theme within a lot of Second Great Awakening texts, which was that if you just paid attention to how you were falling away from your Christian commitments, then you could get back on track and maybe bring people together by utilizing Christian faith in a productive and public way.
So the book is published in 1852, and then what happens? How do people receive this book?
We'll talk about this Tom mania that ensues in the next video.
This is a print showing San Francisco Harbor in 1848. There's a little smattering of houses and a few boats in the water. It looks pretty peaceful, and it was. San Francisco only had about 1,000 residents, and California had only newly become a U.S. territory at the close of the Mexican-American War. And this is a photograph of San Francisco Harbor in 1850. The water is crowded with ships, and the land is crowded with houses. Less than 2 years later, San Francisco had 30,000 residents, mainly young men who had come from all over the world, making the city perhaps the most culturally diverse place on Earth at that time period. What happened? The short answer is gold. In January 1848, gold was discovered in California, near the Sierra Nevada mountains, right about here. San Francisco was the gateway to that gold, the nearest harbor where ships could land, with prospective gold miners from the East Coast, Europe, South America, and Asia. Before the gold rush, the non-Indian population of the state of California was about 15,000 people. By 1860, it was more than 350,000. And in the same time period, the Native American population decreased from 150,000 to only 30,000. The gold rush and its impact on California is one very dramatic illustration of the causes and effects of westward migration in the years surrounding the Civil War. This drive to expand the United States west to the Pacific is often called manifest destiny, based on a phrase that was coined by New York journalist John O'Sullivan, who wrote in 1845 that westward expansion would be the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The word manifest, in this sense, means clear or obvious, and providence is another word for God's help. So O'Sullivan was saying that God had provided the continent for the United States to expand, and it was obviously the destiny of the United States to do so. But despite the prevailing idea that the American West was an empty land full of limitless resources, there were, in fact, a lot of Native people already living in the West. And the arrival of people not only from the East Coast, but from all over the world in the second half of the 19th century would have enormous effects on both people and politics. So let's start by talking about what drew immigrants to the West in this era. First and foremost, they were drawn by economic opportunities available in the West. Before there were gold miners flooding San Francisco, most people who went to the West were farmers. As land became scarcer in the East, a trickle of farming families headed to the fertile Willamette Valley of Oregon through the Oregon Trail. After the discovery of gold in California, and later in Montana, westward migration increased exponentially. But only a few miners actually struck it rich, mainly those who were already in the area before gold was discovered. Mining and farming weren't the only economic opportunities available in the West. Many people found work in the industries that served the miners, like hardware stores, boarding houses, and restaurants. There was also the railroad. Between 1860 and 1880, the miles of railroad track in the United States tripled. And as the railroad expanded, so did opportunities for work on the railroad. The expansion of the railroad was one way that the federal government facilitated westward migration. In 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which granted railroad companies more than 100 million acres in order to complete a transcontinental railroad, which they did in 1869. The Transcontinental Railroad reduced the time it took to get across the country from 5 months to just 6 days, which made traveling and transporting goods to and from the West much easier. In 1862, Congress also passed the Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres of land for free to anyone over the age of 21 who had never taken up arms against the U.S. government, so no one who was affiliated with the Confederacy, as long as they made improvements to the land within 5 years. And this included women, immigrants, and African Americans. The Homestead Act was the wartime extension of the ideas of the Free Soil movement to populate Western lands with small, independent farmers rather than slaveholders on giant plantations. More than 1.5 million people acquired land this way. The last reason that Americans headed west that I'll talk about here was cultural messaging of the time period. I mentioned earlier this notion of manifest destiny, that the United States had a divine mission to spread across North America. Closely related to that was a widespread belief among whites that American civilization was superior to other cultures, and that any barriers to U.S. expansion, like Native Americans and Mexican Americans who possessed the land onto which settlers flooded, were obstacles to progress and civilization. This painting, which was painted in 1872 by the artist John Gast, is called American Progress. In it, you can see an allegorical figure of America holding a school book and helping to lay telegraph wire. She brings with her symbols of American civilization, railroads and covered wagons, and farmers with log cabins, and she drives away symbols of what the artist portrays as wilderness or savagery, Native Americans, buffalo, even an angry bear down here. You can even see how the artist painted the right side of the painting with a bright, clear sky, and the left side with dark shadows and clouds, so that this central figure of America seems to be driving out the darkness. I encourage you to pause the video and see how many symbols of civilization and symbols of wilderness you can identify in this painting. Now that we've discussed the causes of westward expansion, let's talk about some of its effects. A major one is an increase in sectional conflict. As new Western states joined the Union, it inflamed tensions over the balance of power between free and slave states in Congress, which ultimately would lead to the Civil War. Another effect was an increase in racial conflict in the West. As people from all over the world came to the West and competed for land and gold, there was a surge in racial violence. Before and after the Civil War, as white settlers crowded onto the lands of Plains Indians, the U.S. Army sought to exterminate them or confine them to reservations. In California, white miners sought to expel foreign miners and Native Americans from regions with gold. Vigilantes killed or expelled 80% of the native population of the region in just over a decade. Also in California, vigilante groups attacked Chinese communities and even tried to destroy Chinatown in San Francisco in 1877. The state government in California also imposed high taxes on foreign miners, especially the Chinese. These discriminatory laws would lay the groundwork for the first race-based immigration restriction in U.S. history, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The enormous increase in westward expansion in this era led to unprecedented prosperity for some and unprecedented misery for others. But in 1877, at the end of the Reconstruction era, the process of westward expansion was not yet complete. Many of the political, social, and economic consequences of the events in this time period would become even more pronounced in the last years of the 19th century. From the very beginning of English settlement in North America, the contrast between the southern colonies and the northern colonies was stark. Things didn't improve much when the 13 colonies rebelled in 1776 and became an independent nation. Tensions over slavery flared during the crafting of the U.S. Constitution and repeatedly during the 19th century, when compromises in 1820 and 1850 barely maintained the fragile balance between northern and southern states. But in 1860, the wheels finally came off, and the southern states seceded from the Union, starting the Civil War. After more than 80 years of compromise, why did the differences between the North and the South finally become irreconcilable in the 1850s? In other videos, we've traced the differences and similarities between the North and South from the colonial era until the late 1840s in terms of economics, social structure, and commonly held ideas about slavery. Let's revisit those comparisons for the years immediately leading up to the Civil War and see if we can identify why the conflict intensified in the 1850s. The difference between the economies of the North and South began way back at the outset of colonization in North America, when the cold climate of the North prevented large-scale plantation agriculture. Instead, the northern economy centered on trade and manufacturing. The first and second industrial revolution turned the northern economy into one based on factories, where men, women, and children worked for long hours, sometimes in dangerous conditions. In the 1840s, the potato famine in Ireland and revolutions in Europe prompted many Irish and German immigrants to come to northern cities in search of factory jobs. But even though most factory workers in the North struggled to make ends meet, there was some opportunity for social mobility, to climb the economic ladder. And therefore, the North also had a growing middle class in the mid-19th century. Many in the lower class held out hope that they could move out west and start a small family farm in order to become financially stable. So, to recap, the class structure in the North looked kind of like this: a large working class of laborers, many of them immigrants, a middle class of managers and small business owners, and a small upper class of factory owners, bankers, and successful merchants. In the South, cultivating valuable cash crops to sell on the national and international markets had always been the center of the economy. Cotton had slowly replaced tobacco as the #1 crop in the South, and American cotton plantations were producing nearly 70% of the world's cotton supply by 1860. With agriculture working out so well for plantation owners, there was no need to industrialize as in the North. All the labor on plantations was done by enslaved people, who had no hope of improving their lot in life except by running away. There was also a large number of poor white farmers who owned no slaves, and a few modest planters that owned fewer than 10 enslaved people. Despite the popular myth of gigantic plantations across the South, only 0.1% of slaveholders owned more than 100 people. The class system in the South was extremely rigid and aristocratic, not far off from a medieval feudal society, with a handful of wealthy white families dominating in each southern state. Wealth was measured in the South by the number of enslaved people a planter owned. Poorer whites aspired to buy enslaved people and become plantation owners themselves, but their prospects of doing so were pretty slim by the 1850s. Growing cotton quickly depleted the soil, and so both large plantation owners and whites who dreamed of becoming large plantation owners looked to the west for new lands to cultivate in order to expand the cotton kingdom. In short, the class structure in the South looked a little like this: a large permanent underclass of enslaved laborers, with non-slaveholding whites above them in rights and in economic power. Then there was a small number of planters who owned a few enslaved people, and at the very top was a tiny fraction of large planters who owned more than 100 enslaved people. So how did these economic differences lead to tension? Well, first, there were tensions over whether the economic policy of the federal government promoted agriculture or manufacturing. Things like tariffs and the expansion of the railroad turned into bitter fights over whether the government was prioritizing the needs of one section or the other. And then there was westward expansion. Both Northerners and Southerners looked to the West for their future economic opportunities, and both sides suspected the other of trying to suppress their paths to social mobility. The ideologies of the North and South also diverged sharply in the 1850s. In the North, most whites didn't object to slavery as it existed in the South, but worried about the potential expansion of slavery to the West. The Free Soil movement aimed to preserve Western lands for small white farmers. There was also a growing sense among Northerners that the South had too much power in the federal government. Thanks to the Three-Fifths Compromise, which granted Southern states representation in Congress for 60% of its disenfranchised, enslaved population, in addition to its white population, this was a fair charge to make. Many events of the 1850s, like the Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled Northern whites to assist in capturing runaway slaves, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which reopened the possibility of allowing slavery north of the Missouri Compromise line, and the Supreme Court's decision in the case Dred Scott v. Sandford, which claimed that African Americans weren't citizens, convinced Northerners that what they called the slave power had come to dominate government. Consequently, the abolition movement, which called for the immediate end of slavery everywhere, grew considerably more mainstream in the 1850s. Writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the influential abolitionist novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, activists like Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery and toured the North lecturing about its evils, and vigilantes like John Brown, who led deadly raids on slaveholders, dramatized the moral evil of slavery to a growing audience in this time period. In contrast to the North, white Southerners believed they had the Constitution on their side, and that Northern attempts to limit the expansion of slavery constituted an assault on their liberty. In addition, white Southerners began to craft a proactive defense of the institution of slavery in the 1850s. Instead of treating slavery like the South's embarrassing but necessary peculiar institution, as they had in the past, Southern commentators began to frame slavery as a positive good. They pointed to the conditions of immigrants in Northern factories, who might be injured in an accident at work and then be fired for no longer being productive. Slave owners argued that they treated their enslaved laborers better than Northern factory owners treated their wage slaves. Southern sociologist George Fitzhugh wrote 2 books arguing that slavery was preferable to the kill or be killed environment of unbridled capitalism, and that poor whites should be enslaved in addition to people of African descent in order to protect them from being eaten alive in the free market. In looking at these economic, social, and ideological differences between the North and South, it's clear that by the 1850s, there was really a clash of cultures going on. Would the United States be an agricultural nation or an industrial one? One where anyone, no matter their color or place of birth, could climb the social ladder? Or one where just a few deserved to enjoy all the blessings of liberty? In 1860, these questions would propel the country into civil war.
Hi, this is Kim from Khan Academy. Today we're learning more about the landmark Supreme Court case, Dred Scott v. Sandford. Decided in 1857, the ruling in the Dred Scott case inflamed sectional tensions over slavery, which had been growing ever more heated over the course of the 1850s. Originally a case about whether one man ought to be free, Dred Scott v. Sandford transformed into a case about African American citizenship and the future of the institution of slavery itself. To learn more, I sought out the help of 2 experts. Christopher Bracey is a professor of law at the George Washington University School of Law. He's an expert in U.S. race relations, individual rights, and criminal procedure. Timothy Huebner is the Irma O. Sternberg Professor of History at Rhodes College and the author of Liberty and Union, the Civil War Era and American Constitutionalism.
So, Professor Bracey, can you take us through a little bit? Just who was Dred Scott and why did he bring this case?
So Dred Scott was born around 1800 and was the slave of Peter and Elizabeth Taylor Blow. In 1818, Peter Blow decides to move his family and Dred Scott to Alabama, where he had bought a cotton plantation. That didn't go so well. So he sells the plantation and moves the family and Dred to St. Louis, Missouri, where he had purchased a boarding house called the Jefferson Hotel.
And that period really was a period during which the nation was arguing over the status of slaves and the rights of slaveholders and the future of slavery in new Western territories. And this issue came up in a very significant way, in a very controversial way, in the question of the future of slavery in the territory and ultimately the state of Missouri. After 2 years of arguing over this, finally in 1820 and 1821, a sort of compromise was set out by members of Congress. North of the southern border of Missouri, with the exception of the state of Missouri, slavery would be banned.
In 1830, Elizabeth Taylor Blow dies, and Peter himself dies 2 years later. But before he does, he makes an arrangement to sell Dred to an Army physician by the name of Dr. Emerson. Dr. Emerson is an Army physician, so he's going to be stationed in a lot of different places, not just in the slave state of Missouri. In fact, it turns out that Dr. Emerson's first posting with Dred takes him to Fort Armstrong, which is located in Rock Island, Illinois, and Illinois, of course, is a free state. Under both federal law and Missouri law, as understood at the time, Dred would have lost his slave status and become a free man as soon as he stepped foot onto free territory. This was known as the extraterritorial emancipation doctrine.
It was perfectly legal and perfectly possible for a slave sojourner, a slave who had been taken into a free state or free territory, to file suit for his freedom.
Dr. Emerson marries Eliza Irene Sanford of St. Louis. Dr. Emerson eventually dies in 1843, and he leaves the entire estate, including the Scotts, to Mrs. Emerson. Mrs. Emerson decides she would like to hire Dred out to make some money for herself. Rather than be hired out, Dred offers to purchase his own freedom and the freedom of his entire family. But Mrs. Emerson refuses to allow Dred to buy out the freedom of his family. So Dred Scott files a civil lawsuit, what was called a freedom suit back then, in the Missouri State Court. And his claim was that Mrs. Emerson was falsely imprisoning him and his family.
And he was able to do this with the help of the sons of his former owners.
The lawyer is being paid by the children of Peter and Elizabeth Taylor Blow, Dred Scott's first master. In the meantime, you have a new development. Mrs. Emerson has remarried to Republican Congressman Calvin Chafee from Massachusetts, and he can't be a slave owner and still be a Republican congressman from Massachusetts. So Mrs. Emerson transfers title of the Scotts to her brother John Sanford, who is a resident of New York with business ties in St. Louis.
Now it was eligible for the case to go into federal court in that it involved people who lived in two different states.
So now you might be thinking, well, filing a lawsuit against your purported master, that's pretty brave stuff. But as it turns out, freedom suits of this nature were not that uncommon, particularly in border states where the slavery question was hotly disputed. Indeed, there were some 300 or so of these freedom suits that were filed in Missouri during the period in which Dred Scott filed his case. Many people viewed the Missouri Compromise as not so much of a compromise, but as something that was forced upon the slave states. And then you've got the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which gave similar autonomy to those areas to decide the slavery question and whether or not it would be introduced into those territories.
Interesting. So people in the North who opposed slavery, or at the very least didn't want slavery to expand, would have been looking in the 1850s and saying, hey, I thought we already decided this, that there wouldn't be slavery north of this line. And now you're saying maybe Kansas and Nebraska could be slave states.
Right. And that was a huge issue in national politics because Northerners are starting to grow very suspicious of Southerners on the slavery issue. They're starting to speak of what they called the slave power, that Southern slaveholders sort of held all of this power in Washington, and that they were sort of running the show, and that this 1854 Act had made it possible for slavery to potentially expand into an area where previously it had been banned.
And you really do get this escalation of tension. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which basically forced requirements upon free states to ensure the longevity of the slave states by requiring them to undertake certain behaviors in the return of fugitive slaves, only escalated the tension and concern about the status of slavery in American life.
All right, so we're in this incredibly tense time of the 1850s with the slavery question yet unanswered, and Dred Scott and his case get to the Supreme Court. So how does the Supreme Court rule on this?
In a 7-2 ruling, the Supreme Court held that Dred Scott was not a citizen of the United States. And so therefore, he could not bring his freedom suit before federal court, which is really a jurisdictional question. But then the court also goes on to invalidate the Missouri Compromise, despite finding that it lacked jurisdiction to hear the case.
What happens when the case is being argued is that one of the arguments that's introduced is this idea that when Scott had been taken into free territory, he wasn't necessarily free because the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And so what the court ends up doing is not only ruling on the status of Scott, but also on the status of slavery in these federal territories in the West and the extent of the powers of Congress over slavery in the West.
Interesting. So Chief Justice Roger Taney is then leading the Supreme Court, and he, I guess, leads the reasoning about this case. So what were some of the arguments that he eventually accepted and made in his decision?
So Chief Justice Taney is a very interesting figure. He had been on the court for many years. He, in his early years, had been moderately anti-slavery, had freed most of his own slaves, and had made anti-slavery statements. But by 1857, Taney reflected the larger change that had taken place within his political party. Taney was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party had become more Southern-dominated and more pro-slavery. And Taney then, by 1857, really is a symbol of pro-slavery Southern thought.
Justice Taney's opinion is somewhat notorious. He makes a series of arguments, and one is legal, the others are really not legal arguments, as I'll explain. So what he starts out by saying is that just because you're a citizen of a state, that does not make you a citizen of the United States. He says basically the federal government has exclusive authority to decide who is a citizen of the United States. Then he makes a second argument, and he says, even if Dred Scott were a citizen of the state of Missouri, he would not be a citizen of the United States because he's black. And what he meant by that is that the word citizen, as used in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, categorically excluded members of the Negro race.
This is fascinating because it seems to me like Justice Taney may have been kind of ignoring a long history of free people of color in the United States who had voting rights, who had property rights.
He was, and that was part of the criticism of the majority opinion that comes in, especially the dissent written by Justice Benjamin Curtis. Curtis had the lengthier of the two dissents and the more thorough legal argument. Because, as you point out, that in 5 states at the time of the founding, that African Americans did exercise the right to vote. That was a sign or some sort of an indication of their status as citizens. And so the argument made by Justice Curtis then is that Taney's reading of history was that the founders had not intended for African Americans to be part of the people or the citizens that were referred to in the text of the U.S. Constitution.
What Justice Taney has done here as basically created a blind spot for himself. And he goes on to point out that this is not his belief, this belief in Negro inferiority, but he said that it was a fixed and universal belief within the civilized portion of the white race. He said it was an axiom, a truth. But what's interesting is that he says this without a citation. He says that these aren't his views. These are the views of the framers, the great men who were high in literary accomplishment, high in their sense of honor. He said that they perfectly understood the language that they used and how it would be understood by others. And there's this great quote in the opinion where he says that they, the framers, knew that it would not in any part of the civilized world be supposed to embrace the Negro race, which by common consent had been excluded from civilized governments and the family of nations and doomed to slavery. What Justice Taney has done here is he's attempted to rewrite history.
So how did the American people respond to the Dred Scott decision at large? Were they generally for it or aghast by it?
Well, as you might expect, things were split exactly down the middle. What we see in the South is white Southerners believe that the ruling is a vindication of what they had been arguing. Southerners had been arguing for many years, going back to John C. Calhoun, that Southerners and that Southern slaveholders had a bundle of rights. And they argued that they had the right to own slaves as property in the southern states. They argued that they had a right to recapture fugitive slaves who escaped into the North. And they also argued that they had a right to take slaves into the West. And so Southerners then feel that the court and the U.S. Constitution are on their side. You see a lot of folks in the North who are hostile to what the court has done. Because once again, they see it as further evidence that the court is dominated by the Democratic Party, by the slave power. And many of these folks then are going to be members of a new party. And that was, of course, the Republican Party.
I think the abolitionists were furious. And I think Frederick Douglass's statement, calling it a brazen misstatement of facts of history, a scandalous and devilish perversion of the Constitution, resonated. And even future presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln, that same summer that the case was decided, went out and denounced it publicly.
So Lincoln, of course, wins the election of November 1860, which becomes a precipitating event of the Civil War. Do you see the Dred Scott decision as being a really important cause of the Civil War?
Yes, so these things are all linked, absolutely. Think about the ruling by Taney and Dred Scott, ruling that slaveholders' rights are absolute. Taney rules African Americans have no rights. Slaveholders have total rights. This makes it possible for Lincoln to rise as a sort of political leader in the North because he has something that he can strongly criticize. Because Lincoln basically makes the argument that the founders had hoped for slavery to disappear ultimately, and Taney's making exactly the opposite argument. So the interesting thing is, if you sort of think about how this story sort of ends, it ends in March of 1861 when Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as the 16th president. And who swears him in? Of course, Roger B. Taney. So between the time when Lincoln was elected in November of 1860 and the time when he takes that oath of office in March of 1861, 7 southern slaveholding states. Those are the states that leave the federal union first. 4 other states, of course, will join them, but not until after the Civil War has already started.
So there's no compromise of 1860. Instead, what we get is a 4-year-long Civil War where more than 620,000 Americans are killed. And at the end of that war, the North, the United States, is victorious, and slavery in the 13th Amendment is abolished forever. So how does the end of the Civil War relate back to the Dred Scott case?
The 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment has to sort of undermine or overturn the other part of the Supreme Court's ruling, which was this issue of the rights of those who previously had been held as slaves. And the 14th Amendment then is going to do that work by stating that all who were born in this country by virtue of their birth here are citizens, and that they have rights that will be protected by the federal government. And if you think about it, what has changed, what has shifted, is the whole sort of national discourse of rights, from the emphasis on the rights of slaveholders that we see in 1857 to an emphasis on the rights of those who previously had been held as slaves. And arguably then what we see really during the Civil War and Reconstruction is the advent of a new sort of discourse focusing on human rights. And that, I would argue, is profoundly significant.
So, what happened to Dred Scott after this? Did he and his wife live to see the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery?
Unfortunately, Dred Scott did not. The Supreme Court renders its decision in 1857, but he dies, unfortunately, in 1858. His wife, Harriet, though, lives on to about 1876. So she did live to see the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery. The Dred Scott case made clear at the time that the struggle for citizenship and, of course, the later struggle for civil rights is about the desire to be treated with equal dignity, to be viewed as possessing equal humanity. And what is perhaps most moving, I think, about the Dred Scott case is the dignity with which the Scotts carried themselves throughout the entire ordeal, despite the court's best efforts to deprive them of that dignity. It was ultimately Dred and Harriet who gained the respect of the nation. And it was the inhumanity of the court and the institution of slavery that was laid bare for all to see.
So we've learned that the ruling in Dred Scott helped bring about the Civil War by further dividing the North and South over the issue of slavery. Opposition to the case's outcome propelled Abraham Lincoln to the national political stage, and opposition to Abraham Lincoln propelled slave states to secede after his election as president. But the Dred Scott case was also about the lives and fates of one man and his family. Although Dred didn't survive to see the end of slavery and the passage of the 14th Amendment granting equal citizenship to African Americans, his family lived to see the rewards of the struggle he began. To learn more about the Dred Scott case, visit the National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution and Khan Academy's resources on U.S. history.
This is Sal here, and I'm with Kim Cutts, who's Khan Academy's American History Content Fellow. And what I'm curious about is, you know, in school you learn about the Civil War, you learn about slavery, that slavery was a cause of the Civil War, but at least for myself, I never got a full context of, you know, what were all the dynamics that led to the Civil War? Is it just something that happened overnight?
Oh, definitely not. You know, I think the seeds of the Civil War were really with the United States at its creation. You know, I think there's a sort of an essential contradiction in the United States as it's born. You know, we're this country where all men are created equal, except that most of the states in the South have slavery, where people are clearly not created equal. So, you know, they couldn't win the Revolutionary War without including those states and kind of giving them what they wanted and retaining slavery. But it means that, you know, the U.S. is born with both free states and slave states, and they're going to continue to try to figure out how to balance those for the rest of the 1800s.
And we have this map here, and this map is a later period, but it shows this is actually closer to the Civil War. But if we even look at the original 13 colonies, you can see which ones were free states and which ones were slave states. And then you obviously have these other states that come in later, which we'll talk about. But what you're saying is, at the founding of the country, this was already an issue. People were, you know, there were people in the North who weren't fans of slavery. Mm-hmm. And people knew that at some point this would be an irreconcilable, or maybe they hoped it would be reconcilable, a difference. But they said, no, we got to unify against Great Britain.
Exactly.
And so they said, let's just become a country and do it.
You know, even Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, he knew that slavery was a contradiction. He called the issue of having slavery like holding a wolf by the ears, right? You can't hold on to it, but you can't let it go, because so many of the wealthy elites who are going to end up in Congress in the South are slave owners. So including
himself.
Exactly. So they want to protect their interests.
So we have that it's the issue is there from the moment that the country is founded, and then we get into the 1800s, which is really the run up. The Civil War doesn't start until we get into 1860 or shortly thereafter. Or actually 1860. What's the big picture that really leads up to it?
Well, I think what we're looking at when we get into the issues that lead to the Civil War is really about how the U.S. handles getting new territory, right?
And the U.S. was getting a lot of new territory. We have a map here. I guess the first really big chunk is you have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And so you get all of, let's see, let me shade it in. You get, roughly all of this stuff right over here. So that's new areas that settlers can go and it becomes officially part of the U.S. And what else happens?
So, as we get these new territories, out of them, you're going to get new states. And when new states come into the Union, they're going to come in as either free states or slave states. So, we've balanced the interests of the North and South up until this point, right, from the Revolutionary War, so that there's equal representation in Congress between free states and slave states.
Well, why does someone care? If I'm someone in Massachusetts, why do I care whether the new state of Missouri is going to be a free state or a slave state?
Well, I think there are two reasons why you might care. First, if you're an abolitionist, and these are the people who we know very well, like Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison, who was the editor of the newspaper The Liberator. These are the people who feel that, correctly, slavery is morally wrong. Slavery is a corruption of the essential principles on which the country was founded. It's something that, destroys lives, destroys families. But another reason, if you're, say, in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, why you might care whether a new state is a slave state, is you're worried about opportunities for yourself out in the West. We know that Horace Greeley, this famous newspaper editor, he says, what do you do if you're a young man in New York, a young white man who doesn't know how to get ahead? He says, go west, young man. You can go out there, you can get some land, you can start a farm. But if you go out there and you find that all of the land has been bought up by rich slaveholders from the South, you might not be able to get any land, and you certainly might not be able to, for example, sell your corn at a rate low enough that you could beat somebody who has free labor.
So there was a lot of times there's a lot of focus on the moral argument, which is a very strong argument.
Right.
But there's also this interesting economic argument, which you just talked about, which is it's hard to compete with slavery. I mean, you're literally talking about labor that does not need traditional wages.
Right.
That is literally slave labor. And so if you are having your own farm and you don't own slaves, how are you going to compete with that? And so that was the reason for some folks in the North on economic arguments. Now, would these people be considered abolitionists?
No, the way that we think about those, we call them anti-slavery. So anti-slavery advocates, they don't think that they can get rid of slavery in the South. Even if they don't like slavery in the South, they don't even see how it would be possible to get rid of it. But they do think that as these new states are coming into the Union, they could prevent them from becoming slave states so that it's possible for the Western lands to remain free. Abraham Lincoln, I think, is a really good poster child for this. I think we'll talk about him a little bit more later. But Lincoln is born in Kentucky, one of these new Western states. His father is a small white farmer. And slave owners move into Kentucky, later becomes a slave state, and his father can't find work. His father can't find land. So he ends up first having to move to Indiana, then moving to Illinois. And so this is literally a case of one of these poor white farmers who just can't compete with slavery, which is one reason why Lincoln himself is later going to come out so strongly in favor of making sure there's no slavery in the West.
So abolitionists want slavery is amoral. It needs to be removed from definitely the United States, possibly the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anti-slavery, they also think slavery is bad. They don't like it.
Right.
They think it's, but I'm not going to fight that fight to remove it. Maybe that's hard to do or impossible. Right. But it shouldn't spread. It's not fair. It's the reason my dad wasn't able to be able to run his farm.
Absolutely.
And so when we get it, so that's the, you have the Louisiana Purchase, and in other videos we talk, that's famously Napoleon sold it for quite cheap because frankly he couldn't defend it because he was fighting these wars, and he's fighting these wars in Europe. That's the first chunk of land. So you have all of these states, and they need to figure out whether they're slave states or free states. But I talked about why would a northerner care whether a slave or a free state? Why would a southerner care? Why would, if I'm a slave owner, I own a plantation in South Carolina or Georgia, why do I care if Missouri is a slave state or a free state?
Well, I think, just as their political interests are tied up in slavery, all of their money is tied up in slavery. In 1860, the most valuable thing that anyone owns in the United States is slaves. Right? You can't compete with that kind of money. So they want to make sure that if a new state comes into the Union, that state isn't a free state, because then the free states might have more representation in Congress, and then they can vote to outlaw slavery. So if your whole fortune is built on slavery, if you're a white slave owner, they outlaw that, then you're left with nothing.
I see. So in the North, there's the moral argument, there's the economic argument, slavery is hard to compete with. And the South, hey, if we have too many of these free states, at some point they're going to have a majority, enough of a voting power in the government to maybe abolish slavery one day, which would completely undermine, if I'm a slave owner, my economics of my reality.
Right. I mean, and they are sort of essentially amoral. Even, someone like Jefferson, who knows that slavery is wrong, his whole wealth, his whole fortune, his whole political dynasty is built on the fortune of owning slaves.
And one of the first points where this really gets balanced, this issue, is we have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, then starting to carve out the Louisiana Purchase, you have states like Missouri, they get to their critical mass of people, of population, so that they can become a state. And so what was the Missouri Compromise all about in 1820?
So the Missouri Compromise is when we have enough people living in Missouri. These are white people generally who have come from the eastern states, and they apply for statehood. You've got an equal number of slave states and free states already in Congress. So if Missouri comes in and they want to be a slave state, they're going to upset the apple cart. They're going to upset the balance. So there will be more representatives for the South than there will be for North. And everything they've done so far has been predicated on this sort of tenuous balance between free states and slave states. So, they debate this in Congress just for months. And eventually what they do is say, all right, well, we can't decide. So what we're going to do is admit the state of Maine at the same time.
And Maine, the territory of Maine was already part of the United States. How is it not already a state?
It was part of Massachusetts, but as you can see, it's really only tenuously connected to Massachusetts. So they divide this territory up so that it can have its own representation in Congress. So they say, all right, well, we can't solve this problem of the balance of power between free states and slave states right now. So what we're going to do is just kind of extend our balance. We're going to keep this compromise going to make sure that there are the same number of free and slave states. So we'll let Missouri in as a slave state at the same time we let Maine in as a free state.
Fascinating. So I think, I see where this is going, that you have these very tenuous compromises while more and more territory is being added. It's exciting to see where all of this goes. So Kim, in the last video, we started talking about how slavery has been an issue in the United States really since its founding with the Revolutionary War. And we see some images here of slavery. This was a particularly famous image that really kind of helped spark indignation in the North amongst abolitionists, because you can see how this person was beaten or whipped.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's this kind of, and today it's like this morally reprehensible thing. But you go back not too far in the whole scope of history. We're going to the early 1800s, and this was something that was debated. It was slavery was allowed in a large chunk of the United States. And in the last video, we talked about that this issue of slavery only got exacerbated the more territory that was added. You have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. that adds all of this territory. You start having states getting carved. Once you get a critical population, a critical mass of people in a certain state, they can apply to be, or in a certain territory, they can apply to be a state. And as each of these states are added and they want to get representation, it's a political issue. You mentioned how, the North, they didn't like it on moral grounds, and if it was a slave state, and they also didn't like it on economic grounds, because it's hard to compete economically with slavery, while the South was afraid of losing its political power if more free states were to join the Union. And in Compromise of 1820, you mentioned that, well, that compromise, Missouri is a slave state, Maine gets carved out of Massachusetts, becomes a free state. But that didn't solve the problem. That problem only continues because we only add more territory.
Yeah, I mean, most of the history of the 1800s when it comes to slavery is a history of putting off the problem, right? Henry Clay becomes this very famous legislator because he's good at compromising. He's called the Great Compromiser. So instead of trying to actually solve the issue of slavery, which many people think of as an unsolvable problem, they're just saying, all right, well, how can we put off the conflict over this a little bit longer?
And they just keep doing that. In 1836, the territory expands further, or it starts to. I guess the expansion is catalyzed further by you have the Texas Revolution. Texas gets its independence from Mexico, which itself got independence only a few decades before that from Spain. But so Texas, for a brief amount of time, is its own independent country. But then it joins the U.S. It's annexed by the U.S. in 1845. So it's more territory for the U.S., and that was slave territory. Texas.
Right. Yeah. So again, this is an area in the South where most of the reasons that slavery existed in the South is because it's a very fertile agricultural region, right? Where the things that you grow, crops, are very labor intensive. So they figure, how are we going to find enough people to grow these crops? And the answer is that they've been importing African slaves and forcing them to work.
And the annexation of Texas, there's border disputes with Mexico, which leads to another conflict with Mexico, not this time with the U.S. and Mexico. This is the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. But in the context of this conversation, the reason why it helped bring the slavery issue even more to a head is that when the U.S. wins it, it gets even more territory. It gets all of this area in the West right over here.
Right. It's more territory, and it's more sort of southern territory, which means that it has a high probability of becoming slave states.
And so this map that we looked at earlier in the other video, this is kind of showing what the U.S. looked like as we exit out of the Mexican-American War. We're getting to about 1850. And so what happens then? I mean, is it just one compromise after another at this point?
Well, this is the point where compromise begins to break down, right? Henry Clay, again, is the architect of what's called the Compromise of 1850. As soon as the U.S. goes to war with Mexico, people in Congress are wondering, all right, if we get this territory that we're trying to get, what's going to happen? Are they going to be free states or slave states? This compromise over free and slave states has been going on, for 30 years since the Missouri Compromise, and, even longer if you take it back to 1776. So they're doing exactly the same thing. They're saying, all right, well, let's try to keep a balance of power between free states and slave states, except they add in a couple of provisos that make people really angry in the 1850s.
And who gets angry?
Both, I would say, slave owners and abolitionists and anti-slavery activists in the North.
So I guess that's what makes it a compromise. A little bit of something to make everyone angry. And so what made the slave owners angry about the Compromise of 1850?
Well, one of the parts of the Compromise of 1850, apart from deciding whether these new territories were going to be slave or free, was a part of the act was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that it was a federal offense not to help slave owners recover.
So this was something that would make the abolitionists angry, or the
Yes.
anti-slavery angry.
Yeah, absolutely both. So, for example, if you're maybe living in Massachusetts, you're a white middle-class person living in Massachusetts, you don't think slavery is great. You think it's morally wrong, but it hasn't really directly affected your life, right? You're hundreds of miles away from the nearest slave state. But now the federal government says that if there is a person who has escaped from slavery, who has come to your town, it is a federal offense for you not to help return that person to slavery.
So this fugitive slave, this is part of the compromise. This is part of the compromise of 1850. Is that I could be sitting in Massachusetts, I could be anti-slavery, or I could even be ambivalent about it, but now I have to be complicit in it. If there's a slave, I can't, or if there's someone who's escapes from the South who was a former slave, I have to actively. I can't in any way help them. If I do, I could go to jail. If I'm a law officer, I have to capture that person and I have to bring them back. So it's kind of forcing people who are already not happy about slavery. It's kind of bringing it close to them. They have to partake in it.
Yeah, and these are people who have very strong religious convictions. This is, the mid 19th century is a time when people feel their religion very strongly. And so there are people in the North who are Quakers, who are otherwise religiously opposed to slavery, who, have maybe prayed for the souls of slaves, but it's never been their job to try to keep someone in slavery before. So that is really infuriating. One of the things that you get out of this is a really strong backlash of abolitionist sentiment in the North. For example, Harriet Beecher Stowe, right, she's the daughter of a reverend who's against slavery. She writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes this smash hit.
And when
of
was
a book.
this roughly?
That was about 1852.
Okay, so this is after the Compromise of 1850. So people are getting it really is coming to a head. The people in the North, they're having to partake in this because of the Fugitive Slave Act. You have Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. It makes people even more upset about the realities of slavery.
Right. And in the South, they've kind of gotten away, white slave owners in this time, with people saying, slavery is not really my problem. I don't like it. But now they're seeing a concentrated attack, a moral and social attack against slavery in the North. And their response is to become even more violently in favor of slavery. They pose the idea that slavery is, not just something that we could turn our eyes away from, but it's necessary, but it's a positive good. Slavery is going to actually make the country better. If it weren't for slavery, all of these enslaved African Americans, their lives would be worse without us.
And so, just to be clear on the Compromise of 1850, and there was a bunch of things. We'll do a whole video on the Compromise of 1850, all of the different facets of it. But it's one of its, in terms of this conversation, one of its outcomes is because of the Fugitive Slave Law, it infuriated many of the anti-slavery abolitionists in the North. They became more entrenched in their positions, which made the Southerners more entrenched in their positions. The Southerners didn't necessarily. They liked the fugitive slave law, the Southerners. The Compromise of 1850, it sounds like, it was a compromise. Not everyone was happy, but it sounds like it made the anti-slavery folks more unhappy than the slavery folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes the anti-slavery folks super unhappy, but it also means that now white slave owners in the South, they feel like there's a target on their heads. And so they're going to dig in even further to make sure that their interests in slavery are protected.
And this gets us to the election of 1860, which I guess in some ways was the straw that breaks the camel's back, I guess, from a Southern perspective. And why is that?
Well, during the 1850s, you have all of these political battles over slavery. In fact, it kind of breaks the major political party of the 1850s, the Whig Party. So in 1860, some of these leftover Whigs, they reorganize as the Republican Party. And this is the first election with the Republican Party that we know today. But obviously in 1860, the things that they're interested in, their goals and aims are completely different. And the Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. They're deliberately and publicly against slavery. So they nominate as their political candidate for 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who is well known in the country for having been an anti-slavery agitator. He's given many speeches where he has made very eloquent arguments against slavery.
And we talked about it in the previous video, he's against it I guess, on moral grounds, but perhaps even more, his own father wasn't able to be a successful farmer because he had to compete with slave owners.
Right. So he's brought up to hate slavery because it's a big business that has harmed his own family's economic future. But he comes, I think, to his own conclusion that slavery is morally wrong. What he doesn't think that he can do as president is legally or constitutionally get rid of slavery. He doesn't think that the Constitution allows it. But he is seen as enough of a threat by Southerners that in many cases on the presidential ballots in 1860, you couldn't even vote for Abraham Lincoln if you wanted to. He didn't show up on the ballot in southern states. Nonetheless, he still gets enough electoral votes that he's elected.
And then that's what takes us into the real meat of, catalyzes the Civil War.
Yeah, stay tuned, Abraham Lincoln.
So, Kim, we've been talking about the run-up to the Civil War. We talked about the Compromise of 1850, which angered a lot of anti-slave and abolitionist folks in the North. As we get to the election of 1860, you have Abraham Lincoln getting elected. And a lot of folks view that as a bit of the final catalyst for the Civil War. What's happening, and is that accurate?
So Lincoln is elected as a Republican Party president. This is the first Republican Party president ever. And the real basis of the Republican Party is an anti-slavery platform. They really don't want slavery to extend into the Western territories that have been acquired through the Mexican War. And so they have been making both sort of an economic and to some extent moral argument against slavery. So when Lincoln becomes president, the states of the South, particularly the Deep South or this Cotton Belt area, whose entire economic system relies on slavery, they think that they are under attack, that Lincoln is going to be coming for slavery as soon as he gets a chance as president.
And we're talking about these states down here. This is Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida.
Right. So these are the real cotton states where slavery is highly entrenched. More than 50% of the population is enslaved, working on cotton plantations. It is making the elite people, elite whites in the South, very wealthy. Cotton is just the backbone of their economy.
And so what do they do? Lincoln gets elected. This is November of 1860.
That's right.
And so what do they do about it? They're afraid.
They're afraid that Lincoln is going to do something about slavery. So over the course of this winter period, this is in a period before we moved the inauguration up to January. So it used to be that presidents would be elected in November and not take office until March.
Yeah, we have here this Lincoln gets elected in November, but then he doesn't get inaugurated until March over here.
So there's this long lame duck period where everyone knows that a new political party is going to be in power, a new president is in power, but he's not in office yet.
And so you have James Buchanan sitting around. He's still the president, but
yeah, his days are numbered and his power is pretty limited. So over the course of what they call this secession winter, the 7 states of the Deep South get together and they secede from the Union, one after another. And this includes South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They secede from the Union and they form what they call the Confederate States of America, which is basically almost exactly the same as the United States of America. Their constitution is based very closely on the U.S. Constitution, but it guarantees the existence of slavery. It explicitly says that slavery is allowed and protected forever, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president.
And so when they seceded, for them, it was clearly about slavery.
Right. Everything is about slavery. They are concerned that Lincoln is going to interfere with slavery. They are afraid that because slavery is being outlawed many other places in the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, that
one way or another, slavery's days are numbered, and if they're going to protect their livelihood as slave owners and as cotton planters, they're going to have to form their own nation to make sure that it's protected.
And James Buchanan is officially president when all of this has happened. You have 7 states of the United States, I guess they're not so united anymore, leaving. I mean, is he just powerless to do anything?
Well, he tries a few things. He was a very ineffective president to begin with. It's hard to be an effective president when Congress is so divided over issues. One thing that Congress actually does before Lincoln is in office and before these states officially secede is they try what's called the Crittenden Plan, proposed by John Crittenden of Kentucky, saying, we will officially protect slavery in the Constitution. We will say that you can't outlaw slavery in the South, and we'll even extend this Missouri Compromise line, which was sort of the official line between North and South, between free states and slave states, all the way to the Pacific. So just so you know, Southern states, we'll make sure that we won't get rid of slavery.
So this Crittenden Compromise, this was kind of a last-ditch effort. Everyone started to see the writing on the wall that these 7 states especially were very loose in the socket.
Right.
And this was a last-ditch effort to keep them in the Union, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's really, I don't want to say it's too little too late, but for the South, they have seen the writing on the wall. They've seen that this is going to be their only opportunity to secede. And
Lincoln got elected, and his whole party is based on being anti-slavery.
Right. So they want to get out while the getting is good so that they can make sure that slavery remains in their states.
All right. So during the Slam Dunk period, the 7 states, these deep South states, they secede. Then Lincoln gets inaugurated. He's now president. And we're not really in the Civil War yet.
No, in fact, Lincoln's inaugural address is very conciliatory. We think of Lincoln as being a really great orator, and he certainly was, but his first inaugural address, if you read it, is very much a plea to the South saying, hey, I'm not planning on outlawing slavery, right? So the anti-slavery platform that Lincoln ascribes to is specifically about not extending slavery to the West. So he's saying, I am not in favor of getting rid of slavery where it is, so there's no reason for you all to secede. Come back, everything will be situation normal.
And they don't.
No. As I said, they've already seen that this is their opportunity to make sure that slavery continues by creating their own nation. So in the South, there are a bunch of arsenals and forts that belong to the United States, and most of these are taken over by the Confederacy when it becomes its own nation.
And this is a picture of one right here. This is Fort Sumter.
Right, so Fort Sumter is
right there,
right in Charleston Harbor, and this is a Union fort or a United States fort that's holding out, basically. They're running out of supplies. They have tried to have supplies brought in to them before, which have been repelled. And
so they're holding out. They're well in Confederate territory.
Right.
But they are still controlled by, I guess you could say, United States soldiers.
Right. So they do not want to surrender this fort. And Lincoln lets the Confederates, the rebels, know that he wants to resupply this fort. And the Confederates instead fire on Fort Sumter. They start lobbing artillery at it. And over the course of a day, they force the Union forces in Fort Sumter to surrender.
And this was the real matchstick for the war, but this wasn't the first tension.
No, obviously, this had been going on for some time.
So even into Buchanan's, in his lame duck period, there's probably a little bit of tension.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to be expansive, you could say that this tension is almost built into the Constitution when they don't.
Oh, yeah, you go really far back.
Right.
But especially even post-secession of these first 7 states, there are already some tensions, especially if they're taking over these forts. Former United States soldiers are now thinking about cutting off supplies to other former United States, or to current United States soldiers. And then Fort Sumter sounds like this was definitely the the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yeah,
so
this
to
is
speak.
this is the tinderbox, and I think it's maybe intended to be a tinderbox on both sides, because Lincoln wants to be sure that if there's going to be a war, the North isn't going to fire the first shot. They want to make sure that this is the South's decision. It can be blamed on them if it needs to be.
And this is a pattern you see throughout history: is that no one, at least, wants to officially be the person to fire the first shot.
Right.
They often look for a good reason to fire the first shot because they want to get into war, but everyone wants to have the moral high ground.
Right. And in the South, they are looking to make sure that this is kind of a morale building moment. When they fire on Fort Sumter, they're firing on federal fort, right? In any circumstances, that's going to bring on war. And they're hoping that if they can kind of get this fire started, then these 4 other slaveholding states, or actually 8 other slaveholding states in the South, are going to join the effort. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. So after they fire on Fort Sumter, the fort is surrendered to the Confederacy. Lincoln says, okay, you want to start a war? We got a war. He calls for 75,000 troops, volunteers to put down the insurrection. And he calls them for a 90-day service period, which tells you how long they thought this was going to last. And after Lincoln has asked for this army, 4 more slaveholding states in the South secede. And that's Virginia, the most important of these. It's going to be the real battleground of the Civil War.
And that was today we consider that West Virginia and Virginia, but that was Virginia back then.
Right. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina also join the Confederate States of America. And the war is on.
Fascinating. All right, Kim. So we left off in, I guess, early mid 1861. You have Lincoln gets inaugurated. Fort Sumter, which is kind of the first real conflict of the war, if not the first major battle. Lincoln forms this volunteer army, and then the rest of the southern states secede. 4 more states secede.
Right.
And then what was the first major conflict?
So the first major conflict comes after a number of months. There are a couple of little skirmishes here and there, but nothing super large until about 60,000 troops meet outside of Manassas, Virginia, at a place called Bull Run. An interesting fact, I think, is that Union armies and Confederate armies actually named battles different things. If you've ever been confused about this, the Union armies tended to name battles after bodies of water, whereas the Confederate armies tended to name them by nearby towns. So if you've ever heard the Battle of Manassas and the Battle of Bull Run, they're actually the same thing. It's just the Union officers are talking about this creek, Bull Run, whereas the Confederates are talking about the town nearby.
I see. And the 60,000 troops between the two of them.
Right. So they meet, and this is very close to Washington, D.C., so much so that people go out and they bring picnics to watch this battle like it
They think it's going to be entertaining.
Yeah, they think it's going to be like a football game, and it is not like a football game. It is a gigantic battle. 800 people die that day, which doesn't sound like a lot to us, but it was the most deadly battle ever in American history up until that point. So it's a Confederate victory, which is very surprising to the Union because they think that they have such superior forces that this is really going to be a very short war. You know, this is a quick rebellion in 90 days. We're going to be able to, suppress this rebellion, and that'll be it. But Bull Run is really the first sign that this is going to be a major war. It's not going to be quick, and it is going to be very deadly.
This was July of
61.
1861. Okay, so
Right.
now it's clear to both sides, especially I guess you could say the North, that this is not going to be a short war. So they need to prepare. Like, how are they approaching this?
Well, so both sides have some advantages and disadvantages. For the South, they have some of the same advantages that the United States would have had during the War for Independence. They have home court advantage, we could say, which is that they know the territory very well. And also there's a real incentive for people to protect their homes, right? You're going to care more about a war that's happening on your property than a war that's going to happen very far away. The other advantage that they have is just really, really terrific military leadership. So they have Robert E. Lee, who is widely considered the greatest general of his era. He's truly a military genius. He, in fact, was offered a commission in the Union Army, but when Virginia seceded, he went with Virginia. He preferred his home state. So he is a terrific general, and the Union is going to really struggle to come up with the kind of military leadership that the South has.
Who's in charge of the Union or the Northern, or I guess you say the United States Army?
The United States Army. The first general that Lincoln puts in charge is George B. McClellan. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons. One is that George McClellan is a Democrat, so he doesn't agree politically with Lincoln. I think he would have preferred peace. In fact, in 1864, he runs against Lincoln for president on a platform of letting the South go, basically. And so Lincoln is struggling to match the South when it comes to military leadership, but he does have other advantages. For one thing, there are 4 times as many free people in the North as there are in the South.
And that's you made the point, free people.
Right.
Because the South, as you mentioned, it has a majority of the population was not free.
I wouldn't say a majority of the
majority.
population. In many states, that
In
was
in
the
the
case.
deep South states,
In the deep
that was
South
more likely
states.
to happen. Okay.
Right, but so there are only about 9 million people living in the South, and of those 9 million people, 3.5 to 4 million of them are enslaved. So they're not going to be fighting to
I see.
continue the institution of slavery. By contrast, the North has 22 million people, and it also has a terrific industrial base, right? One of the major cultural differences between the North and South that leads to the Civil War is that the South is primarily agrarian and the North becomes very industrial. But industry is really helpful in a war. They've got, miles and miles of railroad tracks, which means that they can move supplies very quickly. And they also have, hundreds and hundreds of factories that make it easy for them to make munitions.
And this is the middle of the Industrial Revolution, so
Right.
and the industrial base matters a lot. And so, what's given the North's advantages and the South's advantages? How do they vote? What's their strategies? How do they try to play to their strengths?
Right. So the South, they are basically trying to outlast the North. They know that they have this territory, and if the North wants them to come back into the Union, they're going to have to conquer this territory. And, even though it's hard to kind of tell, the territory of the South is actually larger than Western Europe. So in a way, the North has a bigger job to conquer the South than the Allies did in World War II to conquer Europe. So they know that the South is going to the North is going to have to fight a war to conquer them, whereas the South just needs to win the war of waiting,
Of attrition, of just seeing.
Yeah, they're hoping that the North will get tired of fighting. So
Fighting in another person's land, you're not defending your own land.
right, and they know that there are plenty of whites in the North who don't care about slavery. It's not in
They're
their
indifferent. What do they care?
what do they care? In fact, some people are afraid that if the slaves are freed in the South, they're all going to come up north and they're going to compete for labor with poor white people. So there are plenty of whites in the North who have no interest in the slaves in the South being freed, even if that's, not an early war aim of the North. So the South is hoping that maybe they can win a couple of really big battles that show that this isn't going to be a big war.
Or it would be so painful for the North to try to conquer the South, so to speak.
Right. And they're also trying to show that they're serious to an international audience, particularly England, because the South is producing 3/4 of the world's supply of cotton at this point. And England is an industrial nation which is built in many cases around textile manufacturing. So they're hoping that if they show that they are serious about their own nationhood, that they're going to win this war against the North, that England will intercede on their behalf to protect their supply of cotton.
So this would be an appeal to England on purely economic grounds.
Right.
Fascinating. Because England, I mean, they didn't have slavery.
No.
They weren't, but purely economically.
Right.
At least appeal to them.
So, on the other hand, the North's strategy is what they call the Anaconda Plan. And the idea of the Anaconda Plan is that they are going to squeeze the South economically. What they want to do
Like an
is
anaconda.
like an anaconda, right? So they want to blockade the Atlantic Ocean because they don't want the South to be able to sell their cotton to get money. And they also don't want the South to be able to buy the kinds of things that they're going to need to make a war happen. They also want to control the Mississippi River because that's the real main artery of commerce in the West, right? Anyone who is going to be shipping their grain or their cotton is going to be shipping it down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans. So the Union hopes that if they can basically surround the South and make sure nothing gets in or out, then eventually they're just going to starve to death.
And this also goes to the industrial base. It can also produce more ships and et cetera.
Right, and it takes them a while to do that. In fact, at the start of the war, the Union only has 90 ships. I've heard it compared to 5 leaky boats, right? We're not a naval power at this point. And so it's going to take them a while to build up the kind of naval power they need to do that, because this is a 3,500 miles of coastline that they're going to need to patrol.
And it looks interesting. I'm just looking at this map, not getting too much into the details. It looks like a lot of the battles are concentrated right in this Virginia, Maryland area. And then there's more, it's a little bit more sparse, but you have a few that are in the deep south and along this Mississippi corridor.
Right. So there are 2 major theaters of the war. We'd say the Eastern Theater, and this is that sort of 100-mile corridor between Washington and Richmond, where a huge amount of the fighting takes place. You know, it's important to remember that the capital of the Confederacy and the capital of the United States are only 100 miles apart.
Its capital is you can't see it in this map, but
Right.
it's someplace in the middle of Virginia, and then D.C. So it's literally, as you mentioned, you said it was 100 miles apart?
Yep.
Fascinating. All right, Kim. So where we left off, Lincoln gets elected in November of 1860. He's not inaugurated until we get into 1861. Shortly after his inauguration, you have the whole situation at Fort Sumter, which is really the start of the Civil War. We don't have the first major battle until we get to Bull Run. And the overall, I guess you could say, theaters of war, we have this corridor here in the Northeast in Virginia and Maryland, and you also have it in the West along the Mississippi. And the North, the strategy is, well, let's use our industrial base, let's use our larger population, let's use our Navy to see if we can essentially blockade the South, while the South says, hey, we have the home court, we have better leadership, we just need to outlast the North. And so what happens as we get started? We talked about Bull Run being the first major battle. Who kind of comes out better in some of these first engagements?
Well, I think it's a surprise to everyone when the South does much better in the first year of the war than the North, knowing the major advantages that the North has in industrial power, in railroads, and just in the sheer number of people. It's very surprising that the leadership in the South does such an incredible job of really blocking the North's advances. The North is attempting to take Richmond, and Lee repeatedly keeps General McClellan from getting to Richmond.
And then Lee actually goes on the offensive to some degree. I mean, the South essentially wins Bull Run, and they have a series of victories, as you mentioned, in year one.
Right. So one problem that the North has is that Lincoln's generals are just not nearly as skilled. George B. McClellan, that we've talked about, his idea of the South's power is perhaps considerably greater than the South's actual power is. He is forever telling Lincoln, I need more troops, I need more supplies, send me more things. He loves parading his army, but I think he was actually a little too close to the troops himself. He was really afraid to lose anyone, which made him very popular with the army, but drove Lincoln crazy because the North comes out with this really strong numeric and industrial advantage. And as McClellan delays, it gives the South time to build things up over and over again. In fact, Lincoln, who we often think of as being sort of this great grandfatherly, sweet character who has so many words of wisdom, his letters to McClellan are downright snarky. He says to McClellan, if you're not using the army, could I borrow it?
So, and is that what historians believe too? I mean, it looks like Lincoln felt that the reason why year one went in favor of the South, and you know, when we talked about in previous videos, everyone thought this was going to be a fast engagement. The North had all of these advantages. Lincoln believed that maybe it was McClellan wasn't being aggressive enough.
Yes, absolutely.
And do historians believe that too?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's really borne out by the numbers that in many cases where McClellan thought he was facing just thousands of troops, he was really only facing a fraction of that.
And so that made him be a little bit more
He was
cautious.
very cautious.
And so at what point is a turning point, at least in these early stages of the Civil War, as we have here on this timeline, we go from April 1861 to roughly April 1865. The first year, so I could draw that. So the first year would be roughly this. So then we've had several battles after Bull Run, but then we get to Antietam.
Right. So Lee, since he's done so well in Virginia, he decides that he's going to take the army to the north. This is the first time that he heads up into the border state of Maryland, and he meets at Antietam Creek with McClellan.
And this goes back to the naming conventions between the North and South. It's called Antietam. That's the body of water, which the North does. This is Antietam right there.
Right, while the South refers to it as the nearby town, which is Sharpsburg, Maryland.
I see. And once again, this is a big deal. This is the South invading the North now, taking to the offensive.
Right, and this is the bloodiest day in American history when...
Let me make sure I digested what you just said. The bloodiest day. So even, I imagine things like Pearl Harbor and D-Day.
Right. So 4,000 Americans died on a single day, September 17th, 1862, when these two armies meet at Antietam. And on no other day in American history have so many Americans died. Not even on September 11th did that many Americans die.
And was this a surprise to folks?
Yeah, well, I think one of the truisms, perhaps, about military strategy in general is that people are always planning for the last war. Mm-hmm. They're not planning for the next war. And so they learn from their mistakes, but what they don't know how to do always is anticipate what's going to be new about this war. And there were so many new inventions during this time period that really made the Civil War an incredibly deadly war.
Yeah, and you can see, these are pictures. These are Antietam right here.
This is Antietam, yes.
And this is actually looks like Lincoln and McClellan.
Right, meeting at Antietam.
Which is incredibly bloody. And you talk about new technologies or new weapons. This rifle here looks like one of them.
Yes. So this is a war where there's a transition from the musket to the rifle. And what's different about a rifle is that inside the barrel of a rifle there is a sort of spiral-shaped groove, and this spiral-shaped groove makes the rifle much more accurate at a much farther distance. It's sort of the difference between just hurling a football end over end and throwing a spiral. So you can hit a target at 600 yards, which is much
unheard
much
of for a musket, or hard, very hard with a musket. So it gets the bullet spinning, which keeps it on its trajectory better.
Exactly. So we have much more accurate technology, and old military strategy, if you see paintings of, for example, the Napoleonic Wars, just involved a whole bunch of soldiers lining up and going toward each other. Well, when you've got soldiers in a line and very accurate weapons.
I never got why that ever made sense.
I am not sure I do either.
Yeah, I don't
consider
myself a great military strategist, but wearing these bright uniforms and marching in step, in these kind of
it does seem to make you a very good target.
Yes. But anyway, you have the rifle now, much more accurate, and you end up with scenes like this. But what was the outcome of at Antietam?
Well, there are two very major outcomes of Antietam, I would say. One, on the negative side for the North, is this is a battle that is widely photographed, as you can see. Matthew Brady, who was the leading photography studio owner of his time, and it's 1T.
Matthew, okay.
Yeah, very important, only 1T.
Yes, non-traditional spelling of Matthew.
Yes. He sends out his photographer that works for him named Alexander Gardner, and they have roving photographers for the first time. They have wagons, and they take...
Because photography is just becoming a used technology at this time.
And so they have Alexander Gardner photograph the battlefields at Antietam, and as you can see...
E.R.?
That's right, yes.
Gardner.
As you can see, this is just about as far away from the kind of heroic paintings of what battles looked like that people had been used to seeing up until this point. These don't look like, the sort of heroes of the Revolutionary War like George Washington. This is
Gruesome.
This is gruesome.
This is really fascinating because we take it for granted in today's day and age, is that the effect of media on people's perception of things like war. Before the camera, before photographs, if I'm a civilian, I just hear about these, these great stories, and I see these paintings that look very valiant and very heroic. But now with photographs, you see the grim reality of war. I mean, people just shot in their tracks, and young men just, just piled up. It's just very dark, and a lot of the.
Yeah, and it's a real PR problem for the North, because this is before we can really put photography in newspapers. They don't have that technology yet. But these photographs were put on display in Brady's studios. He had one in Washington, D.C. and one in New York City. And people would go and look at these photographs, and it was very shocking to them. It was a level of detail that they had never seen. In some cases, they could make out the faces of the individual men who were dead on the battlefield, and that just seemed, beyond what was imaginable to these people. To think of some poor person going into one of these studios and seeing their son dead there on the battlefield made it very difficult for the North to keep up morale.
Fascinating. So, Kim, we've been talking a lot about the early stages of the Civil War, which were about slavery and the spread of slavery. And I think in popular culture, when we think about things like Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and slavery, the term Emancipation Proclamation, or the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, comes to mind. And I think a lot of folks imagine it to be this really amazing speech that at some point, Lincoln makes this proclamation, and after that point, slavery is just gone from the United States. Is that what it was?
No, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So the Emancipation Proclamation itself was not a speech. It was actually closer to a decree. Even though Lincoln didn't originally come into his presidency intending to end slavery, it became pretty clear in the first year of the war that
he was anti-slavery. He just didn't want it to spread. He didn't think
Right.
that he could end it.
Right. So he specifically says in his inaugural address that he has no intention of ending slavery, and that if the slave states return to the Union, everything will just go back to the status quo. But it very quickly becomes apparent in the Civil War that ending slavery is going to have to be a goal of the North. For one thing, the slaves provide so much of the production for the South that interfering with that production is really important for the North to secure victory. But it also is important on a moral ground. Almost as soon as the war begins, enslaved men and women in the South start going to Union lines, hoping for the Army to protect them. They want to be part of the war effort. They interpret it as a war to end slavery long before Abraham Lincoln interprets it as a war to end slavery. So it becomes clear by the summer of 1862 that the Union is going to have to deal with slavery one way or another.
Now, once again, the reason why it's strategically important is that this war is not going as well as the North would have hoped, or as Lincoln would have hoped. It's lasting longer. The first year, as we mentioned in a previous video, the South was winning, and it was going on the offensive. And then also on the moral argument, I guess it gave the North something more to fight for.
Yes, and even in some pockets of the South, individual Union generals were even making their own small emancipation proclamations. So it became clear that the North was going to need an overall stance on whether this was a war to end slavery. And Lincoln decides, yes, this is going to be a war to end slavery.
And so does he announce it, just all of a sudden, or is he kind of waiting for the right time?
He's definitely waiting for the right time. In the summer of 1862, he makes the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. And even in the summer, he shows it to the members of his cabinets. And they're shocked. Most of them are themselves very strongly abolitionist, but they are terrified that this document is going to be so revolutionary at a time when the North is already struggling, that it's going to force the border states out, that many of the whites in the North who don't care about the fate of slaves are going to leave the war effort. So they advise Lincoln not to just proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation, but rather to wait for a big Union victory to kind of put a stamp on the document.
And just to make sure we understand, I mean, the fear of his advisors was not all the Union states were free states. You had states like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland that were slave states, but still part of the Union. And so the fear is, if you emancipate, or if you say that if you make this proclamation, all of a sudden those states would leave.
Right, and those are very important states. They have a very large white population relative to their enslaved population, which means that if they go to the South, all of those fighters will go for the South. And it's also where a lot of the South's industry is. So it would mean that a tremendous amount of manpower and also industrial power would join the South. So Lincoln and his cabinet are very concerned about alienating these states. They want to make sure that their power doesn't go with the South.
Does the Emancipation Proclamation end slavery in those states, or the entire United States, or just in the South, or just in the Confederate states?
So this is a strategy of military necessity, as Lincoln says. He specifically accepts the border states from the Emancipation Proclamation.
He exempts them.
He
says
them.
this does not apply to them. So it's not a pure moral grounds that slavery is evil and needs to be gone from the earth. He's saying in these states that are trying to secede, he is banning slavery.
Right, and he almost makes it like a form of enticement for the South to come back. He says, here is my plan for emancipation. I am going to put it into effect on the first day of January, 1863. He puts it out in September of 1862, just after the Union victory at Antietam. So this big Union victory gives him the confidence,
the backdrop, the context
in which he can put the Emancipation Proclamation out there. But he says, if the states that are in rebellion come back into the Union before January 1st, then it will be null and void.
I see. So he's still trying to get them back in the fold, and he's willing to accept slavery, at least for the time being, if he could end this war that's turning out far bloodier and far longer lasting than, frankly, anyone, especially folks in the North, had expected it to be. So he didn't immediately say, hey, no more slavery, which might have made the South fight even harder. It's like, hey, well, I'm going to make this effective in January 1863, which would be over here. So you have a couple of months to come back to the mothership, so to speak.
Right. And the South does not take him up on this offer. So when January 1st, 1863 rolls around, he signs the Emancipation Proclamation.
And we have some of the text of the proclamation here. And what I think is interesting, and we have this right on the Khan Academy site in one of the articles, is that it doesn't have the beauty of the Declaration of Independence or even the Constitution. It actually reads kind of like a legal document. I mean, if I read this, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, so it's kind of this legalese, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be then thenceforth and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they make for their actual freedom, which is in spirit, really nice thing to say, but it reads like a legal document. And I could keep going. I encourage the folks listening to read it, and it literally lists the various states. And as you mentioned, it's much more of a decree. It's not this beautiful speech.
Right, and we know Lincoln for his beautiful speeches. The Gettysburg Address is perhaps the most famous speech in American history. And so it's a little bit strange that arguably the most important thing that Lincoln ever does is arguably the ugliest piece of writing that Lincoln ever put out there. It's because he's a lawyer. And we forget sometimes about Lincoln's background as a lawyer, but he practiced for decades. And so what he's trying to do here is really create an ironclad legal document that no one can turn around later and say, well, here's a loophole.
Yeah. Although it has its moments, I mean, right here. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So, I mean, it's kind of, yeah, it's still kind of a legal, yeah, it's not moving to the passions or to the moral as much as kind of, and he even also talks about, well, it is what it is. We'll let other people judge it on their own.
But, you know, what's really important about the Emancipation Proclamation is from that point forward, even though he's particularly putting this on the southern states where any jurisdiction he has is really just what can be enforced by the army, it turns the Union Army into an army of liberation. That as they go throughout the South, enslaved people will flock to them and want to contribute to the war effort. And shortly after this, Lincoln will make it possible. Well, one part of the Emancipation Proclamation is saying that African Americans can join the Union Army as soldiers. And so they really, from this point forward, can play an active role, a direct and recognized role in ending slavery. And this is really the moment when slavery truly starts to crumble.
So in the last video, Sal and I were talking about the Civil War Battle of Antietam. And Antietam took place in Maryland on September 17th, 1862. And just to briefly recap, Antietam was the single bloodiest day in American history. Over 4,000 people died. And Antietam was a signature victory in the Civil War for the North, for Abraham Lincoln and the forces of the United States. And one thing that was really important about Antietam was that Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory so that he could proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation, which was intended to be a real morale blow to the South, and also a signal to both enslaved people in the South, Northern Republicans who were strongly in favor of abolition, the end of slavery, and also the world, especially Europe, that the Civil War had become a fight to end slavery, not just a fight to keep the Union together. And I mentioned in the last video that there were two reasons why Antietam was so important. The first being that it led to the Emancipation Proclamation. The second reason was slightly related to that. The eyes of the world were really on the United States and on the Civil War at this time. And many people in Europe were trying to decide whether they should intervene in the American Civil War. Now, why would they do this? Well, I think the most important reason that they would do this is because the South of the United States supplied 75% of the world's cotton at the beginning of the Civil War. And so to major industrialized nations, especially the United Kingdom, cotton was the source of their prosperity. They based their economy in part around textile mills. This was what England was known for. During the Civil War, the North blockaded the South, which meant that they used the ships of the Navy to prevent supplies from getting in or crops from getting out of the American South. So if England can't get their cotton crops, they might be in a whole lot of trouble when it comes to textile manufacturing. And in fact, the Confederacy was counting on having the support of Europe in their rebellion against the United States, partly for this reason. Now, there were other reasons why Europe might have intervened on behalf of the South. One of these was that Europe was traditionally a highly classed society, and they had a lot of sympathy for the way that the South did things, with a wealthy planter class similar to the monarchy or the gentry in Europe, which which was in control of poorer whites and enslaved people of African descent. Another reason was that it was to the advantage of Europe not to have such a strong nation as the United States operating in the Americas. Remember that this is the era of imperialism, the very beginning of imperialism, as countries like the United Kingdom and France, Germany, and others in Europe begin to look for colonies abroad. And the United States had in 1820 proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine, which said, Europe, keep out of the Americas. We consider this our area of the world. So dividing what had been the United States into two smaller nations would probably have worked out in their favor. So Europe had maybe social or cultural reasons to join with the South, and also political or perhaps foreign policy reasons to join with the South. Now, the South was really counting on the intervention of a European nation. They thought certainly the United Kingdom would intercede on their behalf. And it looked, especially early in the Civil War, like that might be the case. But when it came down to it, the United Kingdom did not intercede for the South, and there were a few reasons why that happened. One of those reasons was that the South had kind of oversold cotton to England in the years leading up to the Civil War. So there was actually a considerable supply on hand, which English merchants had built up before the Civil War, kind of seeing this coming. So the loss of new Southern cotton really didn't turn out to be as big of a problem as many had imagined. And related to that, as the Civil War began to ramp up, both Egypt and India, which were also cotton producers, began to increase their production, understanding that there would be more of a demand coming from England that couldn't be supplied from the American South. So it's interesting to note that it's partly in response to the American Civil War and the northern blockade of southern ships that Egypt and India become the world suppliers of cotton that they will be for the rest of the 19th century. The other reason that England doesn't aid the South is more of a cultural reason, which I think is very interesting, which is that the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we'll talk about more in other videos, was read really widely in England. It was a very popular novel there. The stage shows of Uncle Tom's Cabin were quite common. And this novel, which in the United States had helped to propel the Civil War by showing Northerners how barbaric an institution slavery was, also came over to England. And because the Battle of Antietam allowed Lincoln to make the Emancipation Proclamation to the citizens of England, this meant now that the North was an army of liberation, that they had the choice of siding with either Southern slaveholders who had been demonized in Uncle Tom's Cabin, or with Northerners who were fighting against those slaveholders. So because of the Emancipation Proclamation, and because of these other side issues about the supply of cotton, Antietam really marks the moment when it becomes clear that there is not going to be any European help for the South. And that's really important because think of the American movement for independence. The reason that the United States won, or at least one reason that the United States won, was because of the intervention of France. The South knew that they needed the help of Europe if they were going to succeed. Had England interceded, it's highly likely that the South may have won the American Civil War, and it would have been a separate nation. After the Battle of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation, it became clear that if the South was going to win its independence from the North, it would be doing it on its own. So we've been talking about the progress of the American Civil War, which started in early 1861 after the 11 states of the South, which were slave states, seceded from the Union and tried to establish an independent nation known as the Confederate States of America. And in the first years of the Civil War, things went relatively well for the South. They defeated the North at the Battle of Bull Run, which was a great surprise to many people because they thought that this was going to be a pretty short war, that the South would be quickly defeated and scared away into returning to the Union. But the South had many advantages, including very good leadership in the person of Robert E. Lee, and also kind of a home court advantage at large, since the vast majority of the war was fought in the South. So in this early stage, the Confederacy does quite well until we get to Antietam. And Antietam was this first foray by Robert E. Lee in trying to attack the states of the North in Maryland. And after the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest day in U.S. history, more than 4,000 Americans died on that day, the South was defeated. And that was a major turning point in the war, as we've talked about in previous videos, in that it led to the Emancipation Proclamation and was kind of the moment at which the nations of Europe ceased to consider intervening on the side of the South. So in the next few videos, I want to talk about the later stages of the Civil War. So we get into 1863, and the South is doing relatively well here in Virginia, wins the Battle of Chancellorsville, and now, nearly a year after Antietam, in June and July of 1863, Robert E. Lee decides that he is going to try again to invade the North. Now, he has several reasons for doing this. One is that the war has been taking place largely in the South. So it's summer, people are trying to harvest their crops, and Lee wants to give the South a break. So he wants to take the attention away from this area in Virginia where lots of fighting has happened, and he wants to take the war up into the North. And if the North is distracted by having to defend its own territory, then it can't go on the offensive elsewhere as easily. So Lee's plan is to take the war to the North. And Lee has another reason in his sleeve, which is that he is really hoping that in the election of 1864, which is coming up not too long after this period in mid-1863, many people believe that Lincoln is going to be kicked out of office. Now remember that not a single American president has been elected to a second term or re-elected since Andrew Jackson in 1832. So there's been a 30-year drought of two-term presidents. So Robert E. Lee has good reason to expect why Lincoln might not be re-elected in 1864, and he thinks that maybe one of Lincoln's competitors in the Democratic Party, which will turn out to be one of his own former generals, George B. McClellan, will actually want to end the war and make peace with the South. So there's kind of a morale aspect to this. You can see that many of the things done in the Civil War, and especially as we get into the later stages, are designed at making one side or the other tired of being at war. Now, you may wonder why I'm spending so much time talking about battles, because most American history courses do not emphasize military history whatsoever. But I think it's important to keep in mind in this war, and in some earlier wars like the American Revolution, the battles really determine the policy, right? Because you can't make a decree like the way that Abraham Lincoln decreed the Emancipation Proclamation if you don't have the force of military power behind you. So winning battles, winning the war, those kinds of victories give politicians the popular mandate they need to get things done. So that's why I think it's important to talk at least a little bit about the battles of the Civil War. Now, obviously, Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Appomattox were not the only battles of the Civil War. There were hundreds of battles of the Civil War, but I've chosen these as particular turning points just to kind of give you a very brief overview of the way that military victories and defeats were trending, because along with those military victories and defeats went the policy of the United States and the policy of the South. And if you're interested in the Civil War, it's one of the most written about topics in American history, and there are many wonderful books that will go into great detail about the politics, society, and military history of the Civil War, and lots of great television shows and miniseries that I definitely suggest that you check out. All right, well, with that said, let's talk about Gettysburg. So Lee has brought his forces into the North. And again, he's interested in kind of distracting the North from attacking in the South by bringing the war to them. He's hoping to prolong the war so that perhaps another administration that's more favorable to allowing the South to go peacefully might be in office in the North. And the other thing that he's looking for is supplies. So, once again, the vast majority of the Civil War has been fought in the South, and it's been fought here in this sort of Shenandoah Valley Tidewater region of Virginia, which is really the breadbasket of the South. So when men are out fighting battles, and when battles are being fought on fields instead of crops being grown on them, there's going to be a serious dearth of food in the South. You know, I once heard it said that the most salient political fact of the 20th century was that the Americans speak English, which means that the United States repeatedly allied with Britain in 20th century wars. But if I had to choose the most salient fact of the American Civil War, it might be that you can't eat cotton. You know, the South went to war to protect its system of labor so that it could continue to produce these cash crops like cotton or tobacco. And cash crops they may be, which means that you can sell them for money, but you can't eat cotton or tobacco. And when it comes down to it, being able to feed your troops and feed your populace is something that's going to really help you when it comes to winning a war. So Lee is taking his troops up into the North, and he takes them into southern Pennsylvania, which is very lovely farmland. It's a very beautiful place. If you've never been there, I absolutely recommend you take a look. Go to Gettysburg. It's a very well-preserved battlefield. And as Lee goes through southern Pennsylvania, his troops are taking horses and grain supplies and all sorts of things that the army needs to survive, which are in short supply in Virginia. So this is like a run to the store for Lee going through southern Pennsylvania. On the northern side, General George Meade has been trying to catch up with Lee and cut him off from his invasion of the North. President Abraham Lincoln asks for many volunteers to try to stave off the invasion of the North by Lee, and they end up meeting at Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is just a small farm town in southern Pennsylvania. It's just where these two troops happened to meet as Lee was on his way to the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. And Lee's forces and Meade's forces meet on July 1st, 1863. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg goes on for 3 days. So there's July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd. And the first day goes relatively well for the Confederates. They break some of the Union lines around the edges. The second day is kind of a stalemate where Northern forces and Southern forces, they sustain a lot of losses, but don't make any real headway toward victory. And then the third day, Lee decides that he is going to try to break the center of the Union forces, which means that he is going to try to hit the Union line. And remember, this is in the era of military history where people are still kind of fighting in lines, right through the center, and win the day. Unfortunately for him, that is not what happens. So he tries all day to break the Union lines. There's a very famous sort of last hurrah for the Southern forces in this called Pickett's Charge, when General George Pickett's units charge up this hill at Cemetery Ridge trying to break the line, and they sustain over 50% casualties. So it's kind of a bloodbath for Pickett's unit. And after Pickett's charge does not succeed, the Union forces have officially won the Battle of Gettysburg. And Lee realizes that there's no way that he's going to be able to make anything out of his invasion of the North. And so he turns around and starts heading back to the South. Now, what's important about Gettysburg is that this was what many have called the high water mark of the Confederacy. And by that, they mean this is as far as the Confederacy ever managed to get into the northern part of the United States. This is a second attempt at an invasion by Lee, and it failed. And many people see this as a really important turning point in the Civil War. On July 4th, and imagine the good news of receiving word that your troops had triumphed on July 4th, Independence Day. President Lincoln and the United States get another really good piece of news, which is that Ulysses S. Grant, who will be the future commander of U.S. forces, has succeeded in his siege of Vicksburg, which is a town on the Mississippi River. And when he takes the town on the Mississippi River, Grant has complete control of the Mississippi, which is sort of the major highway in the West. So July 3rd and July 4th are really good days for the United States. And this is kind of the moment when it becomes clear that victory is going to be outside the reach of the Confederacy. And with an unsuccessful invasion of the North and the loss of the control of the Mississippi, the South's time is kind of coming to an end. The other important thing about the Battle of Gettysburg is that it is a tremendously destructive battle. About 50,000 casualties took place at Gettysburg, which makes it the single bloodiest battle in American history, which is different from the single bloodiest day, which was at Antietam, because it took place over 3 days. And this is not 50,000 people dying, just 50,000 casualties, which means either deaths or injuries. Those are men who can no longer fight on both sides. So the tremendous loss of life at Gettysburg is going to lead to the foundation of a cemetery at Gettysburg to bury these military dead. And it's going to be in November of 1863, just a couple months after the Battle of Gettysburg, that Abraham Lincoln will visit the cemetery at Gettysburg and deliver the Gettysburg Address, one of the most famous orations in all of American history. And we'll get to that in the next video. All right, so we left off with the Battle of Gettysburg from July 1st to 3rd, 1863. And as I mentioned in the last video, Gettysburg was a really significant battle in the Civil War. It was a real turning point for the Civil War, at which Lee brought the forces of the South up into the North for a second attempt at an invasion, and once again was turned away by the forces of Union General George Meade. Gettysburg was the most destructive battle of the Civil War. There were about 50,000 casualties. And it, along with the victory at the Siege of Vicksburg, which followed the day after, on July 4th, really start to signify the beginning of the end of the Confederacy's bid for independence. Now, what you may not know about the Battle of Gettysburg is that it was almost the end of the war. In fact, Lee took his army trying to cross back over the Potomac into the South, and the Potomac was flooded, so he and his army were pretty much pinned between this flooded river and the forces of Meade in the north. Now, Meade, if he had attacked